Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia.
This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning. Hello, 16 to 1 listeners. Just have a couple of quick announcements for you before we start the show. This week, we are talking to Emily Chase Coleman of HAI Analytics. Before we get into that, quick producer's note. After more than 5 years of more or less continuous operation of this podcast, my co-host Katie and I have decided that we think we could maybe benefit from taking just a short break to rest and recharge. We're coming back, don't worry. This year, after our year in review episode, that's always at the beginning of June, right when school lets out for the summer here in the U.S. So we're gonna do that episode, our year in review episode, and then you're not gonna hear from us regularly until the start of the new school year, when we'll be back with new programming, new guests, new conversations, all kinds of interesting stuff. We're looking forward to resting and recharging. Just taking a little time away to work on the development of some of the content and stories that we want to tell and not have to keep up with quite the frenetic pace of editing an episode every other week. So that being said, we're looking forward to having a little break, but we're also looking forward to coming back and speaking with you in the fall. So until then, don't forget to sign up for the 16 to 1 podcast email newsletter. That's where you can get the latest updates, episode announcements, resources, workshop offerings, everything like that from Moonbeam Multimedia. That is us. And that's going to be the sort of main way that you hear from us over the course of the summer when we're not regularly publishing new episodes. So sign up. You can do that at our website, 16to1.com, all spelled out. We would love to hear from you. And if there's a story in your local educational community that you'd like us to cover, please contact us using our website or write at hello@16to1.com.
I'm Emily Coleman. I am the co-founder and CEO of HAI Analytics. HAI is a full-service data analytics company serving the higher ed industry. We do a lot of predictive modeling, so we build statistical models that schools use to predict inquiry to applicant conversion, admit to enroll yield, retention, student success. And with those models, we can sort of test alternate scenarios. So we do a lot of financial aid optimization where we're looking at how can we use financial aid strategically to meet an institution's goals. So we're building a yield model, including financial aid dollars as one of the predictors, and then we can sort of simulate changes to that. We do a lot of data visualization. We work with our clients, our higher ed clients, throughout the admission cycle to, sort of manage to their goals. We set up the models that drive the policy, but then we're monitoring the data very closely throughout the cycle to make sure that everything stays on track, because there are always sort of third-party factors out there that come in that aren't expected that we have to react to in real time.
The first question that I have is maybe rooted in some of that disruption. We've been hearing from a lot of our listeners and our constituents, some of it's external political pressure, but we also have these enrollment trends that have been hiding beneath the surface for quite a while that are now coming to bear, within the last decade or so. We've got this shrinking applicant pool. We've got declining enrollment since about the 2010s-ish. And then just demographic shifts. It's not necessarily something anybody can help, but it's just fewer college-bound students right now. And then just the economic factors, like you're talking about tuition and how that plays into enrollment trends. But I'm curious about what your take is from the data perspective. What do you think are the main challenges facing enrollment officers? How does data help them meet those challenges?
A couple of the biggest challenges are, one, you mentioned sort of the shrinking of the enrolling pool. We're about to start go over, I guess, the demographic cliff where college graduating senior numbers will go down. So it really becomes kind of a buyer's market if you think of the students as the buyers. It puts them in a good position, but it does cause more competition with schools trying to enroll their class, and it gets harder and harder to do that. Going along with that is that higher ed is not quick to adapt to changes. So The college system has operated the same way for hundreds of years. And schools need to be more flexible now and kind of meet students where they are. It's not possible for every student to attend a four-year institution where they live on campus and devote all their time to studying. There are all different types of people who are looking to get a college education, and the schools that will be most successful are the ones who can adapt to that and can offer multiple modes of learning. And it's interesting because I hate to say that anything positive came out of the COVID pandemic, but it really did kind of shove schools in that direction. They didn't have a choice at that point. They had to figure out how to teach these students without having live in-person classes. There is a positive side to that where they sort of learned how to do that and can continue to develop those offerings, those virtual offerings or remote or partial residence, whatever the kind of formula is that will work for a broader audience of people looking to get a college education.
We've talked a lot about test optional admissions policies on the show and how a bunch of institutions moved toward that during COVID, now how they've immediately about-faced. I personally am a little bit disappointed in the about-face because I thought that we had this unique opportunity to innovate on what we might consider to be worthwhile admissions criteria, other than standardized test scores. I'm curious what you think about the role of more traditional indicators, test scores, GPAs, things like that, that are showing signs of being less and less helpful to actually admit and retain quality students.
I mean, this is something that I'm passionate about. I am completely in agreement with you. I felt like, this is another really positive thing. The test scores, the standardized test scores, they never even have been super predictive. GPA is much more predictive of success in college. If you add in the standardized test score, it explains a bit more of the variance in how students do, but it really isn't enough to make it worthwhile given all of the shortcomings it has. We know that scores are highly correlated with family income. And there's bias against sort of different ethnicities. When everybody went test optional, I would tell everyone I knew that no one's going to go back to requiring these tests because everyone's going to figure out that they don't need them and, they can do this without. Luckily, a lot of schools, I think, will stay test optional. The ones that have gone back to requiring test scores are kind of the most competitive institutions. So all of the Ivy institutions have gone back.
Yeah.
They will say that they need other criteria to be able to distinguish between students because everyone comes in with like a 4.25 GPA and they've taken every AP class. And I understand the need for that. I think I've been really disappointed in the lack of creativity in coming up with other measures.
Completely in agreement with you there, yeah.
It isn't easy, but just for the amount of time that we've had that we've never come up with anything better is sort of appalling to me. I will say that the College Board, I think they kind of see the future of this and they are working on some other measures that will capture factors. One of the factors that research shows is most predictive of success in college is kind of grit or being able to overcome obstacles, being able to persist in the face of obstacles. And so there's been this thought of, that's great, but how do we really measure that? And if we're an institution that gets 40,000 applications a year that we're trying to read, how do we kind of systematize that or help our readers evaluate that criteria in a consistent way? It's a challenge, but it's one that I think can be overcome. I started out my career at Syracuse University, and my boss and I, Don Sala, who was the VP of Enrollment Management, we actually worked for several years to sort of try to do this, to try to come up with qualitative factors that would allow admissions counselors to get an idea of a student's potential for success. And it took a lot of work. A couple of the reasons we wanted to do that is we had a chancellor who very much believed that a university needs to serve the greater good. She wanted to sort of help the city around. She wanted to lift up the people in society who need that. And so relying on something like an SAT score to admit students to college really kind of is counter to all of that. And then the fact that the scores are so highly correlated with family income, schools are trying to kind of diversify their pools and make their enrolling student pools look more like the general country. And so you can't do that with SAT scores. So anyway, and I'm sorry, I could talk forever about this.
I mean, I can understand from the perspective of the elite university what the issue is, which is just that everybody in the world is looking at small slice of numbers that correlate to test scores, GPAs, the things that they reduce education down to, and they're saying, well, we got to stay at the top of those numbers or else we're going to fall down the U.S. News and World Report. The U.S. News and World Report, I don't know, maybe that's a whole other topic that I should rant about for an entire episode.
That could be a whole series itself.
Well, it's a really good example of what can happen if people are uncareful about the data stories that they tell, because U.S. News might have been helpful when there was no standard data format available to be able to judge the quality of competing universities. Like if I have an option to go to two different places and I'm trying to make a decision, maybe in the early days of the internet, having that data all available in one place might have been a useful thing. I don't know. But I think it's exactly what we've done with test scores. We've done it with the U.S. News and World Report for colleges. We have made it the standard that we try to game with all of our attempts.
Check your boxes.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess I'm just saying, I hear you that it would be really, really difficult to go through the work of trying to put together the qualitative data, whatever factors it might take outside of test scores. I don't think it's easy. And I'm curious if there's even like a consensus out there about what that data looks like so far. I would imagine that you're probably working at the forefront of kind of defining that. Maybe there isn't. It doesn't feel to me like there's a much embrace of that as an admissions attitude or platform. So.
Well, and I can't imagine now the complication of AI being a factor for these essays, which I knew, at one point held such heavy weight. And now I teach English, so I'm like, I trust zero of this. So I'm imagining being someone trying to comb through thousands or whatever.
You're talking about admissions essays being written?
Yeah, I remember how important that was for me. And if you're talking about these, what's the distinction of these students, and they're my students, some of them, that was something they had, like a clear written voice or an interesting story. And now those things are challenged as well.
I think about this a lot. I have a daughter who just started college this year, and I don't know how college professors do this. I mean, you could just not write any paper that you ever have to write. I think that there is the flip side of AI where when we talk about things like how do you measure those qualitative factors or how do you rate them, give them some sort of ranking, I think that AI can help us with that. So where it takes humans a very long time to read through a certain number of essays, computers can do that more quickly. Of course, there's a danger there where you don't want computers. I mean, they're not going to get everything right. But I think it can help us to figure out, what are those factors that we can look for that are concrete? What are some examples of them? And how do we structure it in a way that admissions readers will be consistent with each other and can do this more quickly?
Do you think that consistency with each other is actually important? I was going to ask you about that. Like, does one institution, maybe they have a unique take on what they think their student body should look like, and another one, it makes it hard for students to apply in any standardized way.
But I even took that as like, I'm in this office and you're in that office.
Yes.
Yeah.
So across institutions, there isn't really any effort to be consistent. And I think that's fine. I mean, I do think it makes it more difficult for students, but every institution has its mission. And I think that ranking students based on that mission makes sense. But even within an institution, if you have 20 people reading applications, how do you get them all to make the same calls if they were to read the same essay? The really fascinating thing to me when we first started looking at this at Syracuse is we wanted to remove the factor that had to be present in order for a student to receive a high rating. So if you have a high SAT score, okay, that counts for something. But if you don't, we're going to look for these other things. And the interesting thing to me was that when we started to say, okay, we want to look at how do we measure grit? How do we allow for a student who hasn't done any extracurriculars because he or she has to work a full-time job outside of high school, help support their family? And how are you going to say that, well, they weren't on student council or whatever it is, that has to count for something? What we found was that even the way readers looked at sort of the qualitative factors had some, I would say, income bias in it. So they were talking about things like, well, he's an Eagle Scout or anything that, kids who really are in disadvantaged situations may not have the opportunity to do. It just isn't in their reality. Yeah. It's so unfair that, these kids wouldn't be able to get into the mix and be judged for all of their accomplishments. I think schools are getting better at that. We were able to, after several years of doing this as a pilot project and a lot of work on the admissions counselor's part in collaborating with each other and figuring out how to be consistent, we did make a lot of progress there. I think there are a lot of schools that are doing interesting things like that. We need more of it, for sure.
My students are less involved than I've ever seen them in things at the high school. They play fewer sports. They are not in multiple music groups or whatever. So part of me just wonders if this isn't process kind of adjusting to this change in a student. Because I mean, speaking for Chelsea and myself, like we were in multiple groups. We played sports,
Yeah, and I didn't even know. Like I hesitate to say it's a game because I don't mean you can game it like you can be unfair, but as a student who's seeking admission to college, even though I was super active in trying to be a type A, I didn't understand the game that you're expected to play in the college admission situation. Like looking back on it now, I'm like, it doesn't surprise me that I encountered confusion that I didn't like. I was like, okay, the system is actually set up to be tracking me from the age of like 11 or 12. And I was like, okay, I did not understand this at the time, but they want me to be like mini Mozart by the time I'm a young teenager. And like, that's not what I'm doing. I mean, I'm not like upset with how things ended up working out for me, but at the time I was upset about it. And I just didn't know that this was the kind of behind the scenes situation and that there would be so much difficulty in taking into account those other factors that don't show up in an SAT score.
And we're both still coming from a place of privilege.
Yeah.
But I look at my students, and these are kids who probably could afford their activities, but they just do less. They really do. I hate sounding that way, but
do you think there's some good to that? I mean, I do feel like we sort of got to a place where it was like your kid better be doing, 7 different activities and it just got so crazy. So I feel like a little reset on that is good. I also know that, students are not doing those things because they have social media in their face all the time. And that obviously is not.
I definitely think there's been a cross correction. I think it's going to level because my current students were in middle school for the COVID lockdown because I teach 10th graders. That's a tough time to be at home. I thought it was hard for high schoolers, and then I met these students and I was like, oh, you went through some stuff. So I'm eager to see another 5 years, and I bet that there'll be some middle, you know what I mean? I think we'll achieve something in between.
That makes sense.
You've already talked about SAT scores, other standardized test scores, GPAs. I'm curious if there are other pieces of data that you think are particularly unhelpful to admitting and retaining students. I think retention is a slightly different problem that a lot of colleges struggle with.
The GPA issue is a big problem because when I tell my kids, because they'll ask me like, what was your high school GPA? And I have to tell them like, it wasn't the same then. Okay. It wasn't like everyone didn't have a 4.2 and everyone didn't take 15 AP classes and they think I'm just making excuses. But I do think that we've allowed it to get to this place where we took something that was a really useful indicator and we've made it much less useful. And it's hard to backtrack on that because it requires high schools to suddenly start giving lower grades than they've given and, parents get involved. I mean, there's so many difficulties with that situation. In terms of other factors that I think aren't helpful, I guess it goes back to anything that is correlated with wealth. Those things will be good predictors of retention because students who are wealthier are more likely to retain. Yeah. Putting support in place for students who don't come from wealthy backgrounds and knowing how to evaluate their accomplishments in a way that is, fair to the circumstances that they've been in. I think we're making some progress toward that. I think there are some schools doing interesting things. Some of the testing organizations are doing interesting things, but nothing happens quickly unless we have a global pandemic and then it has to happen quickly.
We're actually in the middle of creating a resource for ed leaders about evaluating artificial intelligence tools for use in educational contexts. What we're trying to focus on in this resource is giving people the tools to understand, like, what, in layman's terms, what artificial intelligence is and how the limitations of how it's designed, how it works, means that it's not necessarily the best tool to fit every, it doesn't go in every slot. And you are somebody who obviously understands advanced statistical methods, this kind of stuff. Are you finding what we're finding, and that's that AI is acting as it should be a stand-in for data visualization or statistical methods or just like any other math library? Are people reaching for AI? I'm curious about the power of that sort of tool. I don't know, either in your domain specifically or for education. I'm curious about what you think the power of that tool kind of is, because I do think there's some opportunities with that technology. I also think people are asking of it things that it's not really designed to do well, and that companies are benefiting from that confusion right now. And so I'm just a little apprehensive for schools as they're trying to navigate all these things, because they're getting screamed at that this is relevant, this is the next big thing, everybody needs to use this now and understand it, and it's going to take over the job market, and it's a lot of pressure.
I'll be happily late to this one. English class is not the first place. I know my place. I'll wait.
Yeah, I mean, I think people feel like they want to be informed about it. And so, if I'm not informed about it, then I'm going to pretend that I am, or I'm just going to keep pushing, what about AI? Because everyone talks about AI to solve every problem. And AI can mean many different things. There are statistical type models, machine learning models, intelligence algorithms. They are mathematical equations, just like the old statistical methodology. They're just much, much more complex. They're, complex to the point where a human wouldn't be able to complete one in a lifetime, and a machine can do it in, 4 seconds. And we see a lot of people, because they hear so much about it, they want to know, do we use AI tools to build our statistical models? The reality is that they are not always better predictors. If you have a huge data set, they can be very powerful. But for the most part, institutions, if we're talking about like enrollment data, we're not looking at that big of a data set. We have a program that will test different models against each other, so we can kind of test the more traditional statistical models against things like machine learning. And often we see that the more traditional, I would say most often we see that the more traditional methods come out as being more accurate for what we're doing.
I know some people on some library and university boards, and those leaders are definitely having conversations about these technologies. This is the early, really frenetic part of a hype cycle that's going to die down, but that at the end of it, we're going to, what will trickle out of all of that hype is the few applications of it that really are extremely useful in these pretty tailored use cases. Yeah. I'm just hoping that we get to that point sooner than later because I'm really kind of tired of it being...
Yeah, Snapchat doesn't need it. That's not improving anyone's life.
I don't need a meta bot. I don't... Anyway...
Please no. Talk to me, Liz. Has it been hard for you as a parent to navigate this process? Are you a little too close, or what do you think? Do you think it helped you?
So my daughter got to where she was thinking about colleges. I thought, this is what I've done for 23 years. This is going to be easy for me.
Right.
Easy. I know this process, and it was
we've got this
so stressful, and I have so much sympathy for families, and even like knowing how things work, it still was just unbelievably stressful. And I feel sorry for my parents because I was the same way. I was kind of like, I'll go to college, maybe, I don't know. And they were like, you're going to college, so. And my daughter she was a little apathetic about it too, but now she's doing great. And it was totally my fault. I was telling her, like, this is when you do this. And all of a sudden I realized I'm talking to my clients and they're talking about their early action applicants. And I thought,
she's not one of them.
Not one of them. He's going to just wait and be part of the pool. So, turned out okay, but much harder than I thought.
What do I tell my students to help make their data better for this process? What can you tell me just as like maybe what you told your own kid? Because I teach seniors. I write rec letters. I do the Common App. I'm way too deep in the Common App on any given day. What's like your words of wisdom, I guess? What would you say?
So I think schools are coming to the realization that they need to really care about recruiting students who will be successful at their institution. Mm-hmm. And it isn't just about, taking the highest test scores, because if you can't keep them and graduate them, then it's sort of all for naught in some ways. So schools are looking more and more at how well a student knows an institution or how well they've researched it. So things like if they can visit campus, there's virtual things. Anything, if there's a school that they're really interested in, my advice would be explore it in every way possible and do it in a way that the institution is aware of. So when I applied to college, my mother and I just went to schools and walked around. We never registered for any tour or anything. And that's college's worst nightmare now.
Yeah.
They want to know who's been there. And you hear so much about it's impossible to get into college and it's so competitive and you have to have, this and that. And certainly there are schools that are very difficult to get into, but there are a lot of great institutions that are not filling their seats and they're looking for more students. I'm a firm believer that you sort of get out of college what you put in. If you go to an Ivy League institution but never take advantage of anything, you're not going to be as successful as someone who goes to, their local branch of their state school and really, really gets involved in the things that they're interested in. Mm-hmm. So I always try to take some of the pressure off because it is kind of crazy. They start to hear about it in fifth grade and you're preparing for it. And I think it loses sight of what higher education is about. And
I agree with you.
I had to get a master's degree before I understood that trying to understand a campus character and kind of the project of a university or a department or whatever it may be, a program, because I didn't even know what I wanted to do well enough. And that's something that I kind of
interesting.
Well, I ended up in a kind of a lucky graduate situation, but it wasn't necessarily because it was a program that made a lot of sense for me to do. But anyway, that's a skill that you have to develop. It's not just innate knowledge that you have.
Yeah. So tell them to visit in person, make connections. That's good. Because it's different even from when I went to school.
Yeah, a lot of colleges will talk to them about go if you can visit us, the schools that you're interested in. Go to the one that feels like home. That feels like this can be my home for 4 years. And I think that is really important. And there's so much emphasis on, as you said, on rankings and things that, they're just like a noise, I think, in the process.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have anything that you want to tell us about that you're working on that you're excited about? You want to promote anything like that before we say goodbye?
What we're working on is just kind of more data visualization tools that help colleges understand their data, understand which students will be successful. They benefit both the student and the institution. And so we sort of are developing more and more dashboards that schools can use for that. Yeah, that's mainly what we're working on.
Well, that's very cool work. We appreciate what you do and that you came on to share with us about it.
You.
And thanks for being
really
here.
Interesting.
Thanks so much for having me.
So what did you think of that conversation?
I thought it was great. I enjoyed getting to ask the questions to like help my own students. So that's kind of where my head is with it.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think I still have a lot of unanswered questions about this. It's certainly a really interesting topic. I want to know if we're moving in the general direction of test optional. I really want to know more about this and know more about what data could even be gathered, because I think that probably it's not even available yet in a lot of cases. Okay. Like the best data that we have to know whether a student is a good fit at a given university, we might not even have the tools to know that yet. So yeah, thanks to Emily. Thanks for taking the time to come on, and we really enjoyed that conversation. After I was done editing the episode, I realized that we neglected to do the thing that we have pretty much always done, which was to ask Emily what she learned in the last couple of weeks. But we decided that we would continue on with the tradition anyway. Do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
I think you should lead, because mine's a kind of a piggyback from what you've learned as well.
Okay. It's kind of a weird one, though. We've been reading together. We've been listening to the audiobook, John Green's book, Everything is Tuberculosis, which, is a pretty dense book about tuberculosis.
It is.
Kind of difficult to listen to, but still fascinating. And I mentioned this, I believe, last episode. Whenever it was, I mentioned I was reading a biography of Richard Feynman by James Glick, and I realized between last time and now that everything really is about tuberculosis, because that book had an interlude in it where I learned that Feynman's wife had tuberculosis and died of tuberculosis. They think that she got it through drinking unpasteurized milk.
Really?
So don't do that, people. So anyway, that's what I learned about it. The book is really dense, and a lot of it is about physics and like Los Alamos, like the sort of Oppenheimer movie timeline stuff. That's Feynman was central to a lot of that work. That's what the book is mostly about. But then in the middle of it, there are just these like soaring, inspiring love letters that he writes to this wife of his who passed away, and it's just like it's pretty devastating, but also beautiful to just kind of stumble upon it. So that's what I've been learning about. How about you?
I'm gonna go just really depressing and on the theme of tuberculosis, which is that I didn't know that all of the Bronte sisters died of tuberculosis. So
every one of them?
All of them. Maria, Elizabeth, and then eventually the surviving ones, which were Brandwell, Emily, and Anne.
Okay.
All of them.
Everything.
I didn't know that.
All
of the
sister.
Brontes.
Every Bronte sister is tuberculosis.
Is and was.
Is and was? Okay.
Forever shall be.
All right. Anything else? Final thoughts, parting shots?
I didn't have a spring break, so I'm just trying to survive the end of the school year.
Okay. We're
Anything
making
from
it.
You?
We're rushing. We're sprinting to June. I think that's about it for me, too.
We'll have I'm looking forward to our upcoming episodes, and I've got some pretty cool news to share in the near future. So it's going to be good.
Cool. We'll look forward to it, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Hey listeners, thanks for supporting 16 to 1. We're your co-hosts. I'm Chelsea Adams.
And I'm Katie Day. Find our show notes, archives, and resources, sign up for our newsletter, or get in touch with us via the contact form at 16to1.com, all spelled out.
We are so grateful for our listener support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the show and telling your friends or colleagues about it.
The show is edited and produced by you, Chelsea Adams, and you're also responsible for our show's music.
And you, Katie Day, serve as lead researcher and social media manager.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show.